I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today for this installment of our Winter Grant Foundation series of conversations, Criticism Inside, Alternatives Alongside, Organizing Otherwise to Intervene in Anthropology's Future. I'm Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences here at UC Irvine, where I'm also a professor of anthropology and law. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today for our conversation with Sarita Amrute. Taylor?
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Nelms. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute. And as Bill said, we are thrilled to be joined by Sarita. Sarita is the Director of Research at Data and Society and Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Washington. She studies race and class in new technology-focused economies, for example, among Indian immigrant programmers in Germany. Which is the subject of Sarita's award-winning book, Encoding Race, Encoding Class, Indian IT Workers in Berlin. So Sarita, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And later on, we'll be joined by 3 PhD students who are here with us. Kim Fernandez from the University of Pennsylvania, Nina Medvedeva from the University of Minnesota, and Nima Yolmo from the University of California at Irvine. And again, I just want to thank and acknowledge the Winter Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research and the UC Irvine School of Social Sciences for supporting this event. Now, this is a webinar format, so we'll be having a conversation among those of us you see on the screen, but you're welcome to join in by posting any questions or comments you have in the Q&A field, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You just click on the little speech bubbles, and then you can post your comments. And Taylor and I and the grad students will do our best to get those in during the Q&A segment. And I think with that, I will hand it back to Taylor to get us going.
Thanks, Bill. As Bill mentioned, this is the 4th of the series of webinar conversations. We'd love to be doing these in person, but I think we're making do in the virtual format. And we're really excited to welcome Sarita with us today. Previous conversations have included guests like Joan Donovan from Harvard and Mary Gray from Microsoft Research and Indiana University. And so we'll be building on some of the lessons learned from those conversations previously and exploring new topics today with Sarita. So maybe we'll just start by asking Sarita to tell us a little bit about what you do, where you do it, and how you ended up doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Just want to say a quick thanks to Bill and Taylor and Jenny for helping get us organized. And also thank you to Kim, Nima, Nina, and Joshua for joining us. Let me start by situating myself a little bit. I'm currently sitting in Brooklyn, the traditional homelands of the Canarsie people. And I want to acknowledge the pathways that they lay down all around us. Some of the major streets here in Brooklyn, like Flatbush Avenue, were Canarsie paths. They've been used for a very long time. All of the immigrants who came to this country and the slaves and the sons and daughters of slaves who built New York. I want to acknowledge all of them today and honor what they have built, this place that I live in. I also want to tell a little bit of a different story about how I got here, who I am, and where we are today, by pointing out that as much as we want this and we want collectively the space and the discipline of anthropology to be an alternative and to produce criticism, it's still an extremely elite space. And that elitism is really noticeable in the institutional affiliations that we all have. Taylor, you just mentioned Harvard, Microsoft. If you have a glance at the curriculum vitae of all of us, you'll see many of the same institutional sites pop up over and over again. Berkeley, Stanford, Chicago, University of San Diego, and the list goes on. So partly I'm mentioning that to acknowledge the fact that any criticism that we produce, the alternatives that we're drafting, are still very much bounded by this longstanding trend in anthropology that has actually worsened since I joined the discipline, in which a few elite institutions, Oxford also, produce most of the working anthropologists in positions like ours today. So I'm definitely situated within that strain of elitism, elite education and training. I was trained at the University of Chicago. But I am also situated as an immigrant, and my situation as a second generation immigrant in that country itself is multi-stranded and quite complex. I brought some show and tell props to give you a sense of that complexity. The first is this very delicate cup and saucer from which I'm drinking my coffee. This cup and saucer is my father's. He brought it with him when he immigrated from Bombay in the 1960s. And he came to the United States on a work visa, like many people do today. He came from a middle class, what then was called upper caste. Now we use the term Savarna background. So he came as a fairly privileged immigrant. But I also brought with me today to show you this map. It's a printout of a map of steamship lines that traversed the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean early through the Suez Canal, earlier in the early part of the 20th century. And these steamship lines were taken by my maternal grandmother and grandfather from India, who they were respectively remarried. My grandmother remarried to my grandfather, which at the time actually completely defied the conventions of her family and her background. She did that because she was widowed at a very young age. And at that time in Western India, the life of a widow was a life of social isolation, in fact, social death. And she contravened those societal principles, and as did her family. They wanted her to have a rich life, but they did not agree or consent to a remarriage. She remarried, and she and my grandfather emigrated to New York City in the early part of the 20th century, where they supported the Indian independence movement. So I come even in my immigration status from this background that is both a background of privilege and a background of dissent, of anti-caste thinking and thought, and radicalism. And so the reason I'm telling you all of this is that I think in a way we have to open the social sciences. We have to open it to experience. We have to open it in the ways that we generally think of to brown voices, Black voices. I know we have Black scholars coming up in this series. I know we have queer scholars coming up in this series, and that's huge. But I think we also have to open the social sciences to experiential knowledge. And even though anthropologists and anthropology really tries to do that in their ethnographic work, we often put that to the side and bracket it out when we do these presentations of self. And so I think some of that needs to be undone. So that's maybe a long way around to say where I come from is from a place in which, as a child, I experienced lots of racism growing up. As an adult, I'm ensconced in a world that's elite, that's part of the educational elite. And I carry both of those experiences with me into my work. And what I try to do, regardless of my institutional location, is track and trace what are the regimes of power at work. What are the contradictions in the way that race or class or technological solutionism is playing out? And where are the moments of dissent at all of those levels?
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarita. You know, just jumping right off on that point, we'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you can bridge these sort of challenges having to do with bringing experience forward and also articulate the relationships of power and inequality that we're all concerned with in the work that you do in your day-to-day now. So we'd love to hear about kind of your own research agenda as it relates to your work at Data in Society and speaks to some of these issues that you just raised. How do you get those things in?
Yeah, That's a really good question. Well, so what I would say in terms of how you get those things in is that it's never accomplished by a single individual, ever. So I am the first director of research at Data and Society. I've been there for about 2 years now. And what I've learned in that time is that the best way to bring critical perspectives to any organization is through relationship building and reciprocity. So some of the things that happen in my day-to-day is reaching out and figuring out ways to support and work with other organizations, for instance, Data for Black Lives, the Algorithmic Justice League. And again, I'm not doing this alone. All the people who I work with are actively building research partnerships, but also partnerships in other ways. One thing that we can provide as a small institution, but one that's fairly prominent, is a space. Okay, now the space is virtual, but before we had a physical space for convenings. We can provide events resources to support that work. And then finally, another big part of my day-to-day is to try to think about the various audiences that we want to reach with our work and we want to help others reach, and to try to provide some of that iterative translational support through editing. Actually, a lot of it is through careful editing to make those ideas travel. So to give you one really concrete example, which was so amazing, I recently helped co-edited a special section of the journal Catalyst, and my co-editor named Luis Felipe Murillo has connections in Brazil with Brazil autonomous communities. And we were able to organize an event through Data and Society that was entirely hosted out of these autonomous communities in Brazil. The name of the group is Rede Macombos. And that was an extremely important event. I think it did an important job of changing the frame through which we think about what we expect of our technologies. It was hosted through Jitsi, which is an independent platform. The event ran longer than it should have. It wasn't very slick. It was beautiful. There was music. And to me, that event was extremely transformative because it made me realize on the question of experiential knowledge, how much our institutions increasingly rely on a certain model of capitalist time and polish and slickness to present themselves as professional. And this event was extremely professional. Everything worked. It's not that easy to set up an autonomous network in which everything works. But the general categories of time and the expectations of what a person would encounter in that online event were completely thrown out the window.
Yeah, that's it. You've made a couple of such incredibly important points already in this conversation, from questioning kind of what constitutes professionalism, the work of small but prominent nonprofits or think tanks, whatever you want to call them, like Data and Society and like Filene in a very different space of financial services rather than technology or sort of that sort of algorithmic questioning space. The work that we can do in terms of providing platforms, providing channels, providing editorial support, financial support often, sometimes, and the work that we have to do ourselves and kind of coalescing coalitions, building relationships to kind of make that work possible. One thing you mentioned was the ways that we can work to sort of frame our work for different audiences. So maybe you can talk a little bit about who you imagine your audiences to be, and who are your kind of stakeholder groups, right, in that kind of nonprofit language, and who do you draw on for support in reaching those audiences?
Well, I can answer this question in two ways, one for Data and Society and then one for me as a scholar. I think the answers are a little bit different. So for Data and Society, our stakeholders are journalists, practicing journalists, technology companies, and there's a kind of asterisk there, and then people who make public policy. So broadly, the US government, but obviously not at the level of the elections or the presidential issues, but at the level of policy. So to start with the first, for journalists, we are primarily working with journalists to think about how to report on what's often called disinformation. So this is a lot of what Joan does as well, to think about how we can get collectively better at not unwittingly spreading obvious falsehoods online. And to reach that audience, largely that happens through public reports, but then it also very much happens through tip sheets, as journalists need to act really quickly. So this question of who our audiences are and how we reach them is really a question of genre, ultimately. So tip sheets work really well for journalists. They need something they can quickly glance at, think through the choices that they're making, and then react really quickly. And then in terms of a second set of stakeholders around tech companies, we also produce reports, for instance, about how, to take an example, YouTube's algorithm pushes content further to the right when you view things. But the real action there happens in meetings. The report really is a sort of calling card to establish our researchers or a body of literature as worth paying attention to. Or in the case of much more lengthy pieces like Alex Rosenblatt's book, Uberland, the way to get the attention of those tech companies is through writing a popular book that's read by a lot of people and reported on. So there's a PR function that can work as well. And then we try to influence how decisions are made in those companies by talking to stakeholders within them. Now, this isn't really the C-suite. It's people who are making decisions about the day-to-day operations of those companies or working in the ethics wings of those organizations. Now, there are so many asterisks there. There's probably at least three. One is the fact that it's not really the report, but as I mentioned, the meeting. The second is the fact that whatever we say is in competition with other interests within the company. And then the third, as I'm sure all of you have followed the recent, as she called it, resignatedness of Timnit Gebru, that she was resigned, basically. All these companies have ethics arms, research arms, that aren't actually doing a very good job about enforcing their own commitments to ethics. So that is a third asterisk in the way that we intersect with companies. Finally, with policymakers, we don't write policy, but what we try to do is provide really the historical analysis that can inform policy going forward. To take a concrete example, one of the things that's probably going to come up very strongly is the idea of algorithmic audits or impact assessments. And what we try to do is think historically and comparatively. For instance, what's the story of environmental impact assessments? How do they look the same or different? What can we draw on the history of those that could have informed some of these assessments going forward? And then in terms of my own work and who are the audiences that I'm trying to reach with my own work, I think, as the way I introduce myself probably tells you, my work is probably a little bit more exploratory than the very directed idea of a stakeholder and something that goes to the stakeholder. But what I am trying to do in my own work, at least initially with the book, is to simply expand the way we think about race and racial capitalism. I think since my book was published in 2016, there has been a lot of work that's done that. I am also really trying to now expand the way we think about infrastructure and what dissent means. I think we're in a moment where we really need to think about what infrastructures support dissent, if we think that dissent is the foundation of democracy, which I do believe that. And then finally, I am trying to reach and think through and learn from a long history of political opposition from within the South Asian diaspora. And so those both, move within my institutional home, but also move way outside them. And that's kind of one of the things that I try to keep alive, both of those alive. They feed each other in my work.
Thank you for that. I think that that's really helpful framing for us to understand the ways that anthropological professionals, public anthropologists, however you want to figure that relationship, and it's really different for each person and from institution to institution, the ways that you have to navigate often professional commitments, professional stakeholder groups with personal goals and other kinds of professional research goals. So, before I want us to get back into this question of race and work and technology, because I know that that's really central to the way that you go about your work and the kinds of questions that you ask. But before we get that, I wanted to give you space to sort of reflect on and maybe push back against a little bit a question around impact, and that's a kind of nonprofit language for talking about change in the world. But I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on, through data and society and or through your own research outside of data and society or alongside data and society, what kind of impact do you hope to have, or how do you imagine your work entering into the world and changing it in some way?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting because, of course, for everybody out there, I got some questions beforehand, which had these key words in them, like theory of change, which I don't like that term. I don't find it useful at all.
Tell us maybe why theory
Yeah,
of
I
change
think I will.
doesn't work.
I had never heard the term before 2 years ago. And when it was first asked of me, what is your theory of change? I immediately thought the question was analytical. Are you a materialist? Do you use science and technology models of how change works? But what the question is actually asking is, what are you going to do to change the world? And I find that so incredibly hubristic and, quite frankly, anti-anthropological, in the sense that as anthropologists, we believe in the unintended consequences of intentional actions. I can have all these intentions about how I'm going to change the world, but that doesn't mean doing those will result in the change that I believe I want to see. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't be strategic. So to be quite honest, I would probably answer it in a Gramscian framework. What are the steps in your war of maneuver? I think that's a much more realistic on the ground question. And one thing that that really transcends whether I'm in a nonprofit space or an academic space is I just feel this constant need to bring people back to the ground. In academic spaces, the pretension is always, well, I'm going to completely change and revolutionize the field. Everyone's a Kuhnian, whether they admit it or not. They think they're going to produce the paradigm shift. And in the nonprofit world, the hubris is often, well, if we pursue this particular line of research, this particular program, then necessarily we're going to lift people out of poverty or end bias in algorithmic harms. And that's simply not the case. I think what I would much more subscribe to is this idea of being open to finding counterconduct, is the way I often think about it. Counterconducts in all of the spaces in which we operate, and asking ourselves, what can I do to push this counterconduct forward? So I don't think I actually have I really can't answer your question. I really would have to answer it in terms of a set of strategies that align with a particular set of interests, not with a set of outcomes.
Can I ask you now to pull that into the organization? Because that's another kind of area that we're really interested in talking about, because so often the kind of theory of change rhetoric is about, you're going to change the world. and not so much about you gonna maintain this institution so that it continues and can serve its public function or whatever. So
Right.
how do you kind of bring that way of thinking, how do you bring the critique of the hubris of theory of change into organizations that often have structures that are like, we're bold and innovative and we have a flat hierarchy and we don't do things the traditional way, even though like often it's completely traditional and all based on the same kinds of privilege and networks and structures that we've seen
Yeah.
since the 19th century.
Yeah. So I really draw here. I've been increasingly drawing on, but also critiquing the work of Jacques Rancière, who, as you know, has a theory of democracy not grounded in consent but in dissent. And so my answer to that question, how do you bring that in, is really by producing opportunities for newcomers to enter these spaces and do something different in them. So, he has, in his writing on dissent, he really talks quite a bit about the newcomer. And, it's almost a litmus test for how your organization is doing. How good is your organization at letting newcomers in and allowing them to shift business as usual? And I would say organizations are variably good at that, and departments within universities are very variably good at that. In my experience, anthropology departments are extremely bad at that. Unfortunately. And I think it has to do with the fact that we often rest on our laurels, because when we go do field work, we are the newcomers. We go through these fieldwork experiences, we bring our findings back from the field, yet when we go back to our home departments, we act as if just having had that experience is enough to make us, woke, or whatever you want to think about, for the rest of our careers. I would say that, speaking from my institutional position at Data and Society, a way to make institutions open to newcomers is not necessarily through pretending you have a flat hierarchy when you don't, but being able to react fairly quickly to opportunities as they present themselves, and then saying over and over again to the people with whom you work that you want them to bring others into the organization. I mean, it's really, again, it's back to this relationship building and valuing those relationships, particularly valuing relationships that fall outside the normal ambit of doing things. So one example of that to me is thinking about artistic practice not as a happy, nice to have add-on or as representational, but as itself a tool of research. So I'm thinking here of the work of Stephanie Dinkins or Shaka McLaughlin, who's a current research fellow at Data and Society, a faculty fellow. And Shaka is producing, we're not sure yet what form it will take, but it may be a series of TikTok videos on the intersection of Blackness and AI. It's quite amazing. And to think about that, or even to think about some of the methods from computer science, some of methods around prediction, not as the outcome, but as a research probe or a research tool that can bring up or surface different kinds of findings about how our social structures work. I think that's incredibly key. We usually call that interdisciplinarity, but really that's such a weak term for what we're describing. It's something else entirely.
And I also think that it really puts a different spin on how we might start to think about the alternative in phrases like alt-ac, right? And so I wonder if we might get you to sort of reflect a little bit on kind of how you think about what alterity means in these kinds of professional settings.
Yeah. And that's a good question. There's two ways that occur to me to answer that question. The first is, one thing I've really learned is that small nonprofit research institutes are more para-academic than they are alt-academic, because we are still existing in an ecosystem in which prestige is very important and funders are very important. And even though Data and Society, for instance, has been very good at taking what's called unrestricted funds or fundraising for things that are unrestricted, meaning you can use the money that you get for any research you want. In order even to get that kind of funding, funders are still looking for superstars. They still want to fund superstars. And so therefore, there's this incredibly tight relationship between the university system, the nonprofit system, sometimes the corporate system, again, going back to the example of Timnit and Google Research, that are all converging around a certain idea of who gets to count as an expert. And that is a relationship that's very hard to dislodge. Because in fact, the very maintenance, back to Bill's point, the very maintenance and repair of the organization depends on getting money from this same set of funders, right? So that's one thing that I think it's really, really important to say. The other way to answer the question of alterity is to really go back to some of Beth Povinelli's early writings on the difference between difference and alterity, right? What are the things that fall really neatly into the categories that we already have? For instance, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are the things that really challenge the boundaries of those distinctions? And that's a question that's a really open one. I mean, I think we have a lot of great thinkers on who help us move beyond difference into alterity. But of course, there's only so much alterity that an institution will bear. You're always kind of looking for that edge where you can push institutions. But there have been times where I have tried to make those moves, and they haven't been as successful because a certain move is just not legible to the organizational structure, and then comes up against this boundary of what an organization needs to actually keep going in the world.
Sarita, I wonder if we might ask you now to reflect a little bit more on the core of your research work, of your academic work around the intersections of race and work, especially in technology industries and organizations. So, how in your mind is work raced, and how is race work? And what does it mean to you for race to be an analytic, right? Either in an applied or public facing setting.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I've noticed throughout my career, but especially since the continued uprising, the movement from Black Lives, is many organizations. I'm not talking about the ones who blackwash, right? Who put up the Black Lives Matter banner on their website and then don't do anything. But many organizations, tech or otherwise, have a sort of flattened view of race, where they think of race as really only about exclusion. But in fact, in my research, and I can also draw on a host of other thinkers, Sophia Noble, Mar Hicks, Winifred Poster, Hector Beltran, Anita Sechan. There's tons of people who help make this point, especially Tressie McMillan Cottom as well, that when we think about a term like racial capitalism, or the intersection of race and technology, we really need to think about three processes. So there's exclusion, then there's hierarchy, which we could think about is in terms of an international division of labor and how it's stratified across global tech firms. The way in which certain types of people are considered white collar software engineers, and others become service workers in the support of those industries. And then the third one, which is really important but is often left off the table, that race is productive. It is a productive category for the production of new technologies. So Tressie McMillan Cottom calls this predatory inclusion. We can think here very, very concretely about the way that data collected about Black and Brown communities gets used to categorize them in particular ways, and gets used then to both provide them services, sell things to them, but also treat them as an experimental market, especially outside the United States, in which new technologies can be tried before they're deployed and rolled out to everywhere else. So those are the three things. And it's really this last one, the productivity of race, and how race is productive changes, of course, across time and space, that makes it such a sticky category. And it's not enough to read Kendi's book and then put on the little badge that says you are an anti-racist and expect everything to just suddenly go away. It is actually a perduring category that has been extremely productive in the history of both the development of technology and the development of capitalism. And so I think one of the things I'm trying to do most clearly in my work, and this goes across genre, this is both in academic publications, but also in things for broader audiences, is to get people to think, when they think race, to think about exclusion, hierarchy, and also value at the same time. And that's actually fairly tricky. And then another thing I would say to that, which is a new turn in my thinking and an evolution for me, and I'll particularly mention Thenmozhi Sundararajan, right? So some of the people I learned from are not necessarily located in academic institutions. She's the executive director of Equality Labs. I've also started to think about caste as a concept, and to think, you know, as Ruha Benjamin's call and Savannah Shange call for an abolitionist anthropology or an abolitionist practice, we can also think of cognate terms like annihilation in B.R. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, to try to think about how race, you know, if race is the mode in which class is expressed, as Stuart Hall says, in Europe and the US, you know, caste is also a major mode of the expression of exclusion, hierarchy, and value. And it's now transnational. It's a huge issue in the tech industry. So I think this also is another way of being open, right? We have to be open also in on our analyses to allowing new concepts and new formations in.
On these, this is such an amazing point, and I want to bring in our colleagues Nina, Nima, and Kim. I'll just note, you know, from the space where I stand inside of financial services, rather than, you know, in tech and data, although those are, you know, increasingly the same, right? This idea of the productivity of race is so profoundly clear when you look at the history of financial services and the history of financial inclusion efforts in particular, and the predatory inclusion involved in the history of mortgage lending and redlining, as Kianga Yamada-Taylor has talked about, or the more recent history of student debt, as people like Louise Seamster have talked about. You know, that predatory inclusion concept does amazing work in allowing us to see the exploitative productivity of race and you know, facilitating the generation of new technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's, you know, it's a really productive way to think through things, and it's been really helpful for me too. So thank you. Let's turn it over to our colleagues, to Kim, Nina, and Nima. I don't know which of you is going to go first, so I'll just turn it over to you all and let you take it from there.
Thanks, Taylor. I think I'll go first. So this is gonna I'm gonna do my best not to make this a two-part question, because those are mean to pose, I think. But this kind of tries to combine this question from Elizabeth Crocker in the Q&A with sort of my own interest as someone who's not in anthropology, but in a gender studies program. So I'm ethnographically inclined and I learn a lot from anthropology, but I'm in a different critical discipline. And so I'm gonna do my best to combine these. But Elizabeth Crocker asks, how can we as a field, and I guess to kind of broaden it, how can critical fields empower non-elites and marginalized communities who are often the subject of research by really determining, analyzing, or equal collaborators in that research? How do we avoid requiring marginalized individuals to gain access to voice in the field only via respectability of elite institutions? So I guess this is a question about just like marginalized individuals. And then are there any things, either other critical disciplines, anthropology itself, or other non-academic sites that are doing a good job of making sure they're included without necessarily this elite component of it?
Yep, that's such a good question. I don't think, I don't think, or I don't believe in a kind of pure politics of the other. I think that and anytime someone's voice is being raised up, there are certain things that are happening. One is tokenization, the other is silencing. There are other voices who are being silenced. So first, let me just say that very clearly. These processes of breaking down elite institutions and their control or hegemony over epistemic production have to be ongoing and perpetual. What I would say in terms of how we do this is, number one, I'll answer it from my field, asking a very basic question: what counts as a technology? Why do only certain kinds of things seem to count? One of the writers I really like to read on this is Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, in which that book is really elevating all sorts of things to the status of technology. And at the same time, thinking with Rede Macombos, who I mentioned last time, they have a very clear definition of what counts for them as a technology, which are things that clearly aid the community. So one thing we have to do is really go back and establish some new definitions or expand our definitions of what counts and who counts. The second thing is to always be aware, and this is something I learned actually from reading Judith Butler, that every social movement we participate in is going to have its own silences and erasures, as Michel Rolfe-Trio would say. And thirdly, if we're looking for places and sites who are doing a good job, I think they're kind of all around us. It's hard to notice them because of the way that we ourselves are being professionalized. But to just name a few, the work of Nick Estes on water protectors is really amazing, because that book, what it's doing is that he shows he himself is from a long line of native experts on the question of land that have been written out of the story of expertise. So I think a lot of what we need to do is archival, actually. We also need to draw on sister disciplines like ethnic studies, African American studies, who often do a better job of this, and gender studies. We can also look toward other kinds of collectives, such as the Allied Media Collective in Detroit, that produces incredible accounts of what's happening with technologies in communities, and is answering what communities need from their own technologies. So actually surfacing and bringing up some of the work that's being done on the ground. So that's where I would begin to think and begin to look. I think there's also super practical things. So I don't know if people in the audience were at the AAAs that were in, was it San Jose when there were the fires happening? Yeah. So yeah. There's both the Let Anthropology Burn piece and the discussion on that was on the Wenner-Gren website, which is helpful. But also there was a session that was about how darn expensive the AAAs are, especially for graduate students, and why graduate students feel compelled to go to these, because that is where they can perhaps get a job. There are lots of practical interventions we can make to open up this field. And that would be a ground level one, a place to start.
Thank you, Sarita. So I had a question about newcomers, and if you could elaborate a little more about that, particularly in the context of institutional setups, as you mentioned earlier, that are bound by older and existing histories of education and training. And I'm also thinking like how that relates to what we assume about autonomy and disposition, political commitments of the decision makers within institutions.
Can you say a little more about the last part of the question?
So I was thinking like in some ways when we talk about like newcomers, or I mean, I'm going to wait for you to like tell us a little more about that, but it feels like the notion of welcoming them is also tied to the level of autonomy any decision maker or like their political commitments within an institution will have. So I feel like that's also something that needs to be built along with the idea of newcomer. So I was hoping you could talk a little more on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm drawing on the work of Jacques Rancière here, who tells us that the strange thing about democracies, if we understand them correctly, is that they assume each person who is ruling or part of a coalition of rulers should be equally exchangeable with any other person. That's the kind of fundamental idea behind democratic institutions. So therefore, a democratic process would have to be open to any newcomer, anyone who arises on the scene should be able to be substitutable with those who are already empowered. Now, obviously, actually existing democracies do not work this way, but that is part of the problem. So what I have been thinking about is what do we need to do to change the way we perceive of our institutions so that they move away from the policing function of institutions, which is to keep people categorized in particular ways and to predefine for them what their role can be, toward a democratic idea of an institution, which has as its horizon of possibility, the idea that in an organization, any person could do any role. So that is a very radical idea. There have been times and spaces that have tried to accomplish that. Everywhere from Bauhaus, in which if you trained at the Bauhaus, you had to start by learning to hammer stone. You couldn't just go straight to architecture. You started from the foundation. To some collectivities that are working today. So in terms of the second question, I believe that's a question more about the actually existing operations of politics on the ground. And so at least for me, I'd like to keep both things in mind simultaneously, both the horizon of aspiration and then also the strategic moves that we would have to make to instantiate that. But again, it's something that we have to do over and over again. Another thinker that's been extremely helpful to me is Denise Ferreira da Silva, who is really trying to think beyond these pre-given categories of political participation, in particular land on the one hand and labor on the other, to try to think across the divide between indigeneity on the one hand and race on the other. And she grounds much of her thinking in what she calls negative accumulation, that in fact, what is grounding both the expropriation of land and the expropriation of labor is the accumulation from slaves and indigenous people of labor and wealth, negative accumulation that continues to ground the accumulation of capital over time. So those are some of the ways that I would start to try to think through that question. It's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Sarita, and for everything that's come up today. I think as we were just talking about politics on the ground, both within and outside the academy, I was wondering if we could return a little to the work of broadening our definitions of who and what counts, and tie that to your thinking on practical interventions toward opening up the profession and the community, and see if there were things that came up for you both in response to the AAAs or other moments within anthropology that are both practical interventions and ways to sort of broaden who we consider ourselves in community with, to sort of revisit or I guess reframe the canon.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, Kim, I'm understanding sort of two different moments in your question. One is a question of exigency. What does anthropology need to do now? And the other is this question of canon. how does the exigencies of the current moment change how we should approach constructing our discipline? Yeah. So in terms of what anthropology needs to do now, I think the agendas are pretty clear and broad. They are the agendas of climate change, of workers and workers' rights, and the agenda of race and inequality. Those to me are the three big ones. And of course, there are tons of overlaps among them, including a big strand that goes throughout, which is the strand of health justice. That's in every piece of those. So some of the big themes there that I think anthropology needs to think through and think on, at least when it comes to the anthropology of technology, is the question of surveillance, especially of workers, immunocapitalism and what form that's going to take going forward. And finally, regulation, the kind of brewing fights between how things are regulated by whom and whether they're efficacious. Do they have teeth? So I don't think that's a question. I really don't like answering questions broadly. What should anthropology do? Again, it seems totally hubristic. We've been trained in a certain way. We have a certain point of view, and each of us individually has a certain set of expertise that intersects with those questions. And so the question, of course, is how to use those. And what I often say to my students is, let's say we're talking about algorithmic bias and prison sentencing. It's a real downer of a class. I just taught that class 2 weeks ago. At the end of the class, what the point I make to them is there are so many issues, right now in the world around us. You could close your eyes and just touch a map and find one, either an issue map or another map. So we shouldn't be asking ourselves, what should we do and sit on our hands? We should, find an issue about which we know something or which we want to know something and see how we can help. Because there are groups, all across the world right now who are actively fighting against the regimes in which they're located. So that's number one. The canon question, I think that's already happening, honestly. I think our graduate students at the University of Washington, the undergraduate and graduate students are absolutely amazing. And I think they have been pushing for many, many years now to change the way we do our graduate and undergraduate education. I myself have really changed my teaching in the last 1.5 to 3 years, in which I am teaching texts that have a larger component of helping us think through how to act, and combining it with works which we've always used to thinking us how to think. Okay, so of course there's an issue there, because once we're being told we need to act, we should be alert to the fact that we're within a capitalist logic in which productivity and a certain version of the present effort reigns supreme, in which everything, including our intellectual production, is economized. So in some ways, I would revolutionize the canon by making us read more Ocean Vuong, right? Read more poetry, because I think, I don't know if everyone caught the Instagram that's been translating around where Ocean Vuong has this great riff on what a metaphor is. It's beautiful. If you haven't caught it, you can look it up. Well, one of the things he says there about metaphor or what writers are is he says they're servants of possibility. And I think, to me, that is a big canonical, I wouldn't say it's a change because it's always been there. It's a canonical pillar that we need to kind of strengthen in the way that we train students to think of ourselves as servants of possibility, and to kind of lean into readings that make that way of thinking really strong. And again, there's lots to choose from.
This was such a lovely framing. Thank you for bringing me to think through with all of us what it is that we need to be asking very fundamentally. I wanted to get to one last question, if that's okay with you, that came up from Orlando Lara in the chat, who was asking about if you could speak to the challenges of doing comparative, relational, intersectional work in a context where we're also being called to reckon with the deep-rootedness of anti-Blackness and its challenge to older frameworks of differential racializations and forms of oppression, particularly through whether we need new approaches for this moment.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. I guess maybe at its heart, the question is asking, do we do more work that's about anti-Blackness or do we do more work that's about intersectionality? I don't necessarily see those as opposed, but I will also say I sometimes find the Afro-pessimist strain of writing correct but limited, and that it definitely identifies and diagnoses the anti-Blackness that is at heart of so many of the issues that we face and is rampant within immigrant communities. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily give us a range of tools in which to move from that correct diagnosis to something that looks much more like solidarity. And so therefore, I sometimes find the work of especially Black feminist writers much more helpful because in fact, they're very, very grounded in building solidarity that's beginning from what we call intersectionality. We could also think of it as articulation. How do different political movements articulate together? When are they compatible? What are the areas of difference within them? And how can we continue forward in solidarity without solidifying or simplifying or flattening out those very real differences?
Thank you so much, Sarita, for joining us today. I wonder, in some ways, I feel like we shouldn't end with a question, but with, a call to action, and so to speak. And, throughout anthropology, especially recently, there have been a variety of movements to try to articulate, both in the voicing and in the organizing sense, what an open anthropology might look like. And I think in some ways, what you've left us with is less the kind of, open anthropology ? But more of the kind of open anthropology ! Right? That there's a real call that needs to happen first, right? That must go hand in hand, right? With the kind of training to action, not just the training to thinking. And that action so often, as you've just pointed out, is about relationship building, to circle us back, relationship building towards solidarity, as you've, that's where you started and where you ended. So, I think that that's a really fantastic place for us to kind of tie a bow on this conversation. But, want to give you the opportunity, any final thoughts, any final imperatives for us to take with us or for those in our audience to take with us?
Read more Black scholars, read more Native scholars, read more Dalit scholars. That's what I would say. And read poetry.
Those are not mutually exclusive.
No, not at all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly productive for me, and I know for all of us, and we really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Yes, this is so fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. They were very challenging and I loved answering them.
And thanks to everyone who attended today. Again, this will be posted online on the UCI Social Sciences website and also via the Wenner-Gren Foundation. And just a plug for our next event will be January 8th, same time, with Hannah Appel from UCLA. And the title of that conversation is Expanding the Anthropological Imagination, Working in, with, and Against Wall Street. We hope to see you there. And again, thank you all for being here and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.